Chapter 3: The Annoying Social Hierarchy. Part of this chapter's materials won't be politically correct, but an objective discussion requires us to seriously clarify: to what degree is a person's or a group's ability to succeed known in advance, and is that a God-given gift or a curse? And if indeed it's predetermined, is there any point to social changes and revolutions? Some years ago, I participated on an assessment committee of academics at my university. The committee evaluated a BA student's potential for further studies in the mechanical engineering department. It was clear to all committee members that this student had no future in the field. Her ability to grasp the material needed for the degree was not her forte, and she failed all math-related subjects. On the other hand, she was very articulate and impressive, and would certainly be an excellent fit in other departments. It was hard for us to tell her this simple truth. Eventually, I ended up being the one to convey the message. So, sure, it was tough, but I truly believed engineering wasn't where she'd shine. 2 years later, I saw her at the economics department's graduation ceremony, looking super pleased and heading towards a far brighter future. We all have trouble accepting bitter facts, but if we're to cope with them best, we have to acknowledge the reality. That's how I like to live my life. Wisdom's distribution. The best way to measure a person's intelligence is via the IQ test, which provides a number between 0 and 215. It's clear to all of us that this test results do not show an equal spread among people. If we want to understand the statement above in depth, we have to first understand the term standard deviation. Formally, standard deviation is the measure of a value's spread in the population relative to its average. Here's an example. When my mother serves her cooking, everyone licks their fingers. In other words, the standard deviation here is 0, because everyone agrees unanimously that the food is great and there are no differences of opinion. By contrast, if I prepare the food and check the reactions of my family, the standard deviation is still 0. That's because everyone agrees that the food is disgusting. Here's another example. At the end of each semester, after I receive a terrifying heap of exam forms to deal with, I find myself racking my brains over how to check the exams such that not everyone will fail, but not everyone will earn 100. In other words, I want the standard deviation to be high enough so that the successful students are discernible from the unsuccessful ones. At this point, we need a brief explanation. In retrospect, it seems like I'm cheating because that would imply that each semester, students are being examined based on differing standards. But here's another factor. If every semester the student population being tested has more or less identical characteristics, then the strategy is correct. There's no self-contained truth, unlike the meter, inch, or volt, etc., for evaluating how well a student understands the material. A student fails if that student, relative to the others, doesn't understand the material, and vice versa, the student succeeds relative to the others. This brings us to the second concept we need to understand: normal distribution, or the Bell distribution. Illustration 10 presents the results of an IQ test given to the general population. The most common result is 100 points, which is why the graph reaches its maximum height at this point. The fact that the standard deviation is not 0 manifests in the way that the graph, rather than being concentrated on a specific point, spreads across a broad range of grades. The reason for the average being a simple 100 is that once the test is over, the results are checked and manipulated similarly to the way I relate to my students' test results. The goal is to enable the bulk of people to achieve a 100-point grade, and the standard deviation will be 15 points, as in the illustration. If we stop a random person in the street and force her or him to take the IQ test, there's a 34% probability that she or he will get between 100 and 115, and a 13% probability that the person will reach somewhere between 115 to 130. The same applies symmetrically in the opposite direction. Chapter 3: The Annoying Social Hierarchy. Part of this chapter's materials won't be politically correct, but an objective discussion requires us to seriously clarify: to what degree is a person's or a group's ability to succeed known in advance, and is that a God-given gift or a curse? And if indeed it's predetermined, is there any point to social changes and revolutions? Some years ago, I participated on an assessment committee of academics at my university. The committee evaluated a BA student's potential for further studies in the mechanical engineering department. It was clear to all committee members that this student had no future in the field. Her ability to grasp the material needed for the degree was not her forte, and she failed all math-related subjects. On the other hand, she was very articulate and impressive, and would certainly be an excellent fit in other departments. It was hard for us to tell her this simple truth. Eventually, I ended up being the one to convey the message. So, sure, it was tough, but I truly believed engineering wasn't where she'd shine. 2 years later, I saw her at the economics department's graduation ceremony, looking super pleased and heading towards a far brighter future. We all have trouble accepting bitter facts, but if we're to cope with them best, we have to acknowledge the reality. That's how I like to live my life. Wisdom's distribution. The best way to measure a person's intelligence is via the IQ test, which provides a number between 0 and 215. It's clear to all of us that this test results do not show an equal spread among people. If we want to understand the statement above in depth, we have to first understand the term standard deviation. Formally, standard deviation is the measure of a value's spread in the population relative to its average. Here's an example. When my mother serves her cooking, everyone licks their fingers. In other words, the standard deviation here is 0, because everyone agrees unanimously that the food is great and there are no differences of opinion. By contrast, if I prepare the food and check the reactions of my family, the standard deviation is still 0. That's because everyone agrees that the food is disgusting. Here's another example. At the end of each semester, after I receive a terrifying heap of exam forms to deal with, I find myself racking my brains over how to check the exams such that not everyone will fail, but not everyone will earn 100. In other words, I want the standard deviation to be high enough so that the successful students are discernible from the unsuccessful ones. At this point, we need a brief explanation. In retrospect, it seems like I'm cheating because that would imply that each semester, students are being examined based on differing standards. But here's another factor. If every semester the student population being tested has more or less identical characteristics, then the strategy is correct. There's no self-contained truth, unlike the meter, inch, or volt, etc., for evaluating how well a student understands the material. A student fails if that student, relative to the others, doesn't understand the material, and vice versa. The student succeeds relative to the others. This brings us to the second concept we need to understand, normal distribution, or the Bell distribution. Illustration 10 presents the results of an IQ test given to the general population. The most common result is 100 points, which is why the graph reaches its maximum height at this point. The fact that the standard deviation is not 0 manifests in the way that the graph, rather than being concentrated on a specific point, spreads across a broad range of grades. The reason for the average being a simple 100 is that once the test is over, the results are checked and manipulated similarly to the way I relate to my students' test results. The goal is to enable the bulk of people to achieve a 100-point grade, and the standard deviation will be 15 points, as in the illustration. If we stop a random person in the street and force her or him to take the IQ test, there's a 34% probability that she or he will get between 100 and 115, and a 13% probability that the person will reach somewhere between 115 to 130. The same applies symmetrically in the opposite direction. COVID-19's outbreak and the endless televised discussions on the pandemic's spread has made us all familiar with the term exponential growth. Simply put, the term relates to a function that increases or decreases faster and faster. The Bell distribution above is in fact an exponential graph. The curve's tail to the left grows exponentially, whereas on the right it reduces exponentially, which means that the number of highly intelligent people becomes fewer at a higher rate as the scores get higher. We all know very clever people, but only 2% of the population will receive high enough scores to rank them as gifted. And finding geniuses is an extremely difficult task because only 1 in every 1,000 people is defined as having an IQ of 145 and up. But why should we care about IQ? We're interested in the social rather than the psychological facet of inequality. And simply put, the unique nature of the IQ distribution graph provides a very blunt clue to why we can't expect equality in society. It's an inevitable result, one that can't be corrected. In Israel in 2018, for example, 4,363 startups were operating. By generous estimates, they employed some 40,000 people, or a half per mil of the population. Approximately the same small number of the population files patent applications each year in the USA, about 200K applicants in 2019. These are the people who drive the economy and society. A similar situation occurs in the majority of areas. Two people with significantly different IQs will experience the totality of life very differently. Countless studies found a correlation between high IQ and educational achievements. As an outcome of academic success and other variables, there's also a correlation between high IQ and success at a person's job, leadership capabilities, the degree of happiness, and lastly, the most important link for our topic at hand, there's a clear correlation between particularly high IQ and socioeconomic success, which is the weighted value of the level of income, level of education, and job success. If we focus for a moment on the curve's left, we discover that some 2.1% of the population whose grade is lower than 70 are defined as mentally retarded. In the USA, this definition covers some 6.8 million people. Another significant figure derived from the graph is that some 13% of the population has an IQ of 83 and less. We can understand the deeper meaning of that information if we refer to the current discussion in the USA on whether there's any value in recruiting people with an IQ of 83 or less to the military. The Army runs an IQ parallel test, and at the moment, the American military's norm is not to recruit anyone whose IQ is less than 92. But the reality is a little more complex. That's not our issue, though, so it will suffice to say that from the USA's perspective, 14% of the population can't be recruited. Now think about the destructive potential in such a high percentage of the population who may feel dissatisfied with their social status. It's not simple to make statements on inbuilt disparities relative to people's capabilities. This ego-stroking era we live in makes it hard to accept unpleasant facts and even harder to cope with their consequences. Remember the assessment committee of academics that I was part of? Many of us discover an evasive approach towards the IQ index and intelligence, starting from claims formulated as IQ is only what the IQ test measures, to claims based on ignorance, such as IQ does not predict success in life. Others will say that there's no connection between my IQ and my social abilities. So, yes, this test is not the word of God, so to speak, and as we'll see further on, it's definitely limited and its results give rise to several questions. But a dismissive attitude, of course, isn't correct. The test is very reliable. In fact, of the existing tests, this one is the best for predicting success. Illustration 12, distribution of typically female professions relative to IQ. Let's continue. Look at illustrations 11 and 12, which track employment distributions based on IQ. The data is taken from a massive study which showed that everyone in society is naturally in the role best suited for that person's capabilities. In other words, the Western economic framework finds a way to make it possible for each of us to produce profits based on our individual capabilities. It doesn't imply that having a low IQ predicts being a failure in life. The world is far too complex for a single grade to typify and define a person's entire life. IQ is a noisy index, though, in the sense that it may somewhat misrepresent a person's actual abilities for verbal perception, working memory, speed of thought, and visual perception. If you've done well on your IQ test, your chances of success increase in just about all areas of life, but that's definitely not a threshold condition. Success involves additional components which together are more influential than IQ. Statistically, there's no significant difference between the salary of someone whose IQ is higher than that of someone whose IQ is average. In practical terms, though, what if your IQ is lower than average? Not an issue. It may be that your choices are more limited, and it may be harder for you to get by. But there's a huge array of professions on which you can focus, from the food industry to restaurateur, from technicians to countless other types of employment. It's reasonable to assume that men and women whose IQ is higher than yours will work alongside you. And if you apply methods you've learned from them in your own work, they won't have any advantages over you. If you add a pinch of motivation and a dash of diligence, your wallet may yet be bulkier than theirs. And what about other traits? A person's financial success isn't the mirror image of that person's IQ. The person may be amazingly wise, but not smart. The person could be brilliant, but not successful, and vice versa. Research in the social sciences has clearly shown that beyond intelligence, there's a universal system of 5 human behavioral traits, known as the Big Five, which optimally typify the totality of human traits. First, an explanation. From your own experience, you've surely noticed that people who think of themselves as happy are usually perceived as social. Similarly, research shows that courteous people are usually also compassionate and often tend to self-sacrifice. Researchers boiled it down to 5 traits which most fully represent the range of human behaviors we can imagine. To understand how they did this, let's go back to our high school days and the materials we studied for our math matriculation exam. It included 5 or 6 primary topics, among them trigonometry and algebra, and it's pretty certain that a student who studied trigonometry well would be able to answer most of the trigonometry questions well. That success has nothing to do with how successful the student is in algebra and vice versa. So for example, someone who succeeded with question 1 will succeed with question 7 and question 94 because they're all related to trigonometry. Someone who succeeded with question 10 will probably succeed with questions 88, 45, and 4 because they're all related to algebra. Now, just looking at the points that students received, anyone, even if they have no clue about trigonometry or algebra, can group the questions 1, 7, 94, and 4, 10, 45, 88. That's exactly the rationale behind defining the 5 traits. A statistician receiving a personality test that includes a large number of questions will try to group the questions and will always discover 5 groups, those which represent the 5 main traits. By the way, if you do the same thing for intelligence tests, that is, you invent a whole range of tests for measuring intelligence and then use them to examine a large enough population, you'll find that those who succeeded on the standard IQ test succeeded on the others that you invented. You'll also find that there's one group of questions which measures intelligence and that the standard IQ test reliably represents it. The Big 5 traits are 1. Extroversion introversion, represents the tendency to direct energy outwards. 2. Agreeableness, represents courteous behavior. This trait is a weighted grade for sympathy, cooperation, warmth, and patience. Women are categorically more pleasant than men. 3. Conscientiousness, represents willingness to work hard, take responsibility, be practical, and be able to self-regulate and focus on a goal. Its opposite traits are being able to enjoy the moment, laziness, irresponsibility, and negligence. 4. Neuroticism, a sense of inferiority, hysteria, and anxiety. The opposite traits are the ability to remain calm, self-confident, and reasoned. 5. Openness to experience represents the tendency to creativity and taking initiative compared to narrow-mindedness, conservatism, and fixation. Note the cumulative characteristics defining conscientiousness. Some of you probably think that they aren't linked to each other and therefore don't reflect a true trait. In fact, the trait probably isn't titled as precisely as it could be. But remember, these characteristics share a strong interdependency. Because practical people are capable of self-regulation, the traits are grouped together as one. The same is true for the other traits. If that's the case, what determines our degree of success at work? We can link some 10% to our parents' socioeconomic status, illustration 13, up to 40% to our IQ, and a large proportion of what's left probably to the other personality components we mentioned. The greater the mental exertion a job requires, 26% of success will rely on conscientiousness and open-mindedness. When it comes to jobs needing creativity, the trait of open-mindedness is more important than conscientiousness. But in any case, it's important to stress that these traits are not linked by a clear axis drawn between good and bad. A trait such as introversion is considered desirable in Japanese culture and a disadvantage in Israeli culture. So there's also an aspect of luck, if by chance you've got a trait that will help you in the culture you're born into. Lucky you. And if an inborn trait isn't helpful, that's too bad. We can sum up by saying that IQ is a person's potential, and other traits, as well as the person's socioeconomic starting point, are responsible for realizing the person's potential. So, when it comes to the Big Five, can a person's traits be altered? I'm a big believer in the ability of each of us to change our personality traits. When I was young, I was the shyest person I knew, but then at 20, I took an informed decision and decided enough already with that. Sure, it took a lot of hard work over several months, but I got rid of the bashfulness as though it had never existed. Science isn't on my side on this matter, though. Comprehensive studies on identical twins raised separately found a 48% similarity for the 5 big traits and a 76% similarity for intelligence. That means personality traits, and especially IQ, are hereditary and you're stuck with your luck. From these data, it turns out that the hereditary component for success in life amounts to 35%, and the rest depends on education, socioeconomic starting point, and the love you received in your childhood. And chance, which also plays an important part, but right now we're talking about statistics. So, let's focus now on the furthest reaches of the bell curve in illustration 10, because in terms of anything linked to society, they're the most interesting. After all, when revolutionaries think about a new revolution, they're usually driven by a sense of discrimination relative to more successful individuals in society, rather than society's largest block of average individuals. Let's imagine a situation where students in my course received advanced knowledge on 1 out of the 20 questions in their final exam. And let's say the knowledge in that class is more or less identical to the distribution of knowledge in last year's course. How can the distribution of grades change? It's reasonable to assume that everyone will get full marks for that question, and therefore the average will be higher by 5% than last year's average. In retrospect, there's no significant difference. If last year the average was 65, then this year it'd be 70. Okay, no big deal. But what happens at the furthest reaches is more interesting, because if 5 students received grades higher than 90 last year and 1 higher than 95, then this year 6 would receive more than 95, which is 6 times more than last year. And that's already a significant deviation. So going back to illustration 10, it means that if there's a subgroup in the general population whose average IQ is higher, even fractionally, than that of the general population, this change would be very significant at the curve's ends. The number of very successful people in this subgroup will be much higher than in the general population. Differences like these, despite being insignificant for the greater majority of the public, can arouse sensations of discrimination, exploitation, and even hatred between the groups. What about differences between women and men? In recent years, we've seen very fast social changes, which we'll examine more deeply later in the book, on all areas relating to the status of women. It's a charged topic, and justifiably so, but in the framework of our journey to understand the source of inequality, we've got to examine whether differences between the genders are an outcome of education and whatever field of study was chosen, or could there be something more deeply embedded? Perhaps IQ, motivation, or personality traits differ between women and men. Let's take a look at those differences. As you can guess, research shows essential differences between women and men vis-a-vis the Big 5 personality traits. For example, men have a lower agreeableness factor and tend to be involved in more conflicts than women. If we choose a random person with poor agreeableness, there's a 60% chance we've chosen a man. But note that the average man has only a slightly lower average agreeableness factor. The significant differences between the two genders are found at the ends of the scale, as previously explained, where the differences between the two genders will be very different. As evidence, men are responsible for some 90% of violent crimes in society. Unsurprisingly, the number of men in jail is significantly higher than the number of women. On the other hand, if we pick a random person with emotional instability, there's a 60% chance we've chosen a woman. Again, that's hardly significant until we examine the bell curve's ends. When we examine students' achievement in math, there aren't huge differences between males or females, but a close look at excelling students shows a huge disparity. the respective ratio of 1:2.5 in favor of males. I remember an argument that erupted between me and Naomi, my future wife, days after we met. I insistently claimed that there was no difference between be angry and be annoyed or agitated. My wife patiently and quietly explained the difference, which to me was too narrow to discern. Years later, when I asked my daughter Tammy, aged 7 at the time, what the difference was, she laughed and instantly gave me an answer. There's no pre-agreed test for checking this claim, but it's clear to everyone that women statistically have better cognitive capabilities when it comes to understanding matters of human emotion than most men have. The statistical differences, therefore, are slim. But because excellence in science inherently presumes economic advantages, whereas care-related professions are characterized by lower salaries, this is a very sensitive issue in feminist discourse. Data for 2018, for example, shows that although women earned the majority of all bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degrees awarded in the US, the number of women who received master's degrees in math, physics, engineering, and computer science is less than 1/3 compared to the number of men. The claim that these differences derive only from designated orientation via stigma-laden education is highly doubtful. Firstly, females speak earlier, their vocabulary is larger, and they make use of more complex sentences. Females almost categorically show no interest in sciences. They're more interested in people. Countless studies, including one that encompassed 500,000 participants, statistically show that the difference in areas of interest between men and women is great, unlike differences for the Big Five or for IQ. Looking at Scandinavian countries again, where a policy of full gender equality has been in place for the past 3 decades, the greatest disparities exist relative to the fields of interest held men and women, with stereotypical areas of interest and a distribution of professions between men and women that's almost identical to countries not typified by gender equality. Experiments conducted with animals confirm this claim. For fun, you're invited to look online for an amusing BBC clip showing macaque monkeys of both sexes being given dolls and toy cars. The males not only chose the cars, but showed no interest in the dolls, and vice versa for the females. Yesterday, I came home early from work to spend some time with my girls. 3 hours together. They were so happy. We had a lot of fun, we did some silly things, we played games. A great day. My wife comes home and right away asks, "Have the kids eaten?" I gaze at her. She looks at me. Why does she always ask that? She knows the answer will be some vague mumble. And the truth is, it always skips my mind. As far as I'm concerned, the main point is having fun with my children, but from her perspective, mothering is a mission, one of the primary purposes of her existence, and being concerned with the welfare and health of her children tops her list of priorities. 7 years earlier, when my youngest, Topaz, was just a year old and cried unstoppably, it really gave me a headache. Naomi would run to her aid, saying, "It makes my heart cringe to hear her cry like that." I'd nod, but the truth was that to me, the noise was primarily annoying. To some of you, this probably sounds strange, but that's what goes through the minds of most men I've spoken to across my accruing years. And it's also a scientific fact. A study examining that part of the cortex responsible for receiving environmental stimuli and emotionally processing them found that in women, this region activated when the sound of a crying or laughing infant was played to them, whereas in men, the same region just died of boredom. Based on this and other studies, we can safely say that for most women, the statement, "family is more important than being a top-level manager," is far more apt than for most men, although at the personal level, I too identify with that statement. What's more, as already mentioned earlier in this chapter, women are more interested in people and men in objects, and that too is a scientific fact which explains, more than any other factor, why the business world is controlled by men, whereas the social world is controlled by women. Having said this, note that psychological research indicates that the father's role in child raising is not exchangeable. Children raised without a father figure suffer from communication problems, show poorer academic achievements, develop stronger drug use tendencies, and experience other issues. In 1913, Emily Davison stood excitedly next to the racetrack in London's outskirts, holding a flag. When the horses galloped past, she threw herself onto the track and was trampled underfoot by the horse owned by Britain's King George V. She was carrying the flag of the suffragettes movement. She belonged to the movement, and justifiably so, since back then women didn't have the right to vote or the right to own property or rights over their children. The terrible list of lack of rights went on and on. Every protest ended up with jail time. I'm mentioning this so that we get a sense of proportion as to the scope of equality between men and women that we enjoy these days. We'll discuss the feminist movement in greater detail later in the book because it plays a major role in the societal changes we've been witnessing in the past decade. But for now, since our goal is to understand the roots of inequality, let's carry on. And what about differences between ethnic groups? The Jewish brain syndrome points to disproportionate cultural achievements among Jews relative to world population. The most evident example is that some 22% of Nobel Prize laureates are Jewish. If we take into account that Jews constitute only 0.2% of the global population, that's 110 times more than the representation from any other ethnic group in the world. But we're not just talking about Nobels. 15% of the Fields Prize winners, the most important prize in math, are Jews, amounting to 75 times more than any other ethnic group. The same applies to the Turing Award for Computer Sciences, 137 times more, the Pulitzer Prize for Literature, 70 times more, and so on. It's worthy of pride, and justifiably. These numbers are often explained by the fact that the average IQ among Jews of European origin is 112 to 115, significantly higher than the general European average. This means that the entire bell curve for IQ among European Jews has shifted a little to the side. But as mentioned earlier, even the slightest shift at the edges of the curve is highly meaningful. Thus, the number of geniuses among Jews can be expected to be far higher than among the general populace. Studies show that from 1957 to 1978 in Israel, significant differences existed among Jews of European origin and those of other origins, but integration has done its work and these differences no longer exist. This is optimistic for all matters linked to the influence of waves of immigration during the past decade on the stability of Western regimes, since successful integration can reduce disparities. Let's now examine whether there are any essential differences which cannot easily be bridged over time between populations. The intelligence quotient, IQ, is a perfectly good means of measurement when we wish to compare the potential for success among people living in more or less the same environment during the same time frame. But we need to be very careful when drawing comparisons among people and populations from different worlds. Take, for example, the fact that there are odd IQ differences between countries. In Equatorial Guinea, the average IQ currently measures 59. Does that mean that about half the country suffers from mental retardation and the rest are blessed at the most with a normative IQ? That's nothing but a foolish conclusion. A better one would be to say that environmental conditions impact their success in the IQ test, and that people in non-Western countries who are unfamiliar with this kind of test will not succeed as well. James Robert Flynn noticed another oddity around IQ measurements. He found that over time, and in various countries, increases in IQ grades among the population rose at a rate of 2 to 3 points per decade. The accepted reason is the improvements to deficient levels of nutrition and education, common at the turn of the 20th century. But it's still strange, and no truly satisfactory explanations have come to light. There is more to this than meets the eye. It's not reasonable to say that at the start of the 20th century, half of the American population were retarded in today's terms, as a large number of research studies seem to show. And think of children in the past decade who spend no small amount of time every day watching advertisements that integrate spinning 3D objects. It's highly probable that their 3D perception is much better than that of kids 50 years ago, which should raise doubts about what the IQ test actually measures and how it succeeds in predicting chances of success so precisely. Incidentally, these aren't problems of measurement. The fundamental differences between populations worldwide show up repeatedly in studies of our current times, too. So let's summarize. After tons of arguments and accusations among scientists, we can all agree that right now some 76% of IQ is sourced in genetics. No one can say precisely which factors might increase IQ, and notwithstanding, it's clear to everyone that IQ is a good index for predicting economic success in Western countries. For those of you who are listening to the audiobook, illustration 15 depicts a correlation between average IQ by country and their economic success. It clearly demonstrates how places with low average IQs, like Uganda, IQ equals 75, have low gross domestic product per capita less than $1,000, while those with higher IQs, such as the USA, IQ around 100, have much higher GDPs. Let's continue. We'd expect then to see a connection between average intelligence as measured in the various countries and their economic success, which illustration 15 shows. The sorry conclusion is that the economic fate of immigrants in the West is determined more or less by their country of origin, at least for the first generation. Several studies indicate improved test outcomes in the second generation. So even if we ignore all other significant environmental factors, it's no wonder that the economic status of immigrants to Western countries is miserable. And what about veteran immigrants? Let's spend a few moments on the issue of economic differences between African Americans and whites in the USA. Research shows that the former consistently receive an average of 15 points less on IQ tests. Note that the conditions we set ourselves for comparing societies are relevant here too. We're talking about two relatively large populations who grow up alongside each other, and the comparison is conducted at the same point in time. If you're thinking that the test is biased against African Americans, you're wrong. Let me explain why. Imagine Aria May, an African American who wants to get accepted into Harvard University. The prospective student is examined and found to have an IQ of 110. If the test is biased against African Americans, then the prospective student must be even cleverer and therefore would be even more successful at studies. Right? So that's the thing. There's no evidence of such a bias, and the prospective student's academic achievement correlates fully to the IQ grade. Let's emphasize again that perhaps IQ and academic success derive from environmental factors which can be shaped. It would seem that as far as the American population, the test is not biased, and we just have to accept this unpleasant disparity. However, as we've seen previously, it's impossible to relate the abysmal economic disparity only to IQ, and there must certainly be other factors that tip the scale. Racism, persecution by hate groups such as the KKK, and federal policies such as redlining. Together with the fact that the transfer of intergenerational capital was not taxed, means that social mobility was hardly an available option for African Americans. Researchers also found a correlation between the absence of a father figure, which is common in the African American population, and an absence of social mobility. BTW, wage disparities between whites and African Americans are not due to differences in IQ. Male and female African Americans were found to have almost identical IQs, which is similarly true for male and female whites. But the incomes of white males are far higher than that of African American males, while the incomes for African American females and white females are similar. A few words about hierarchies. I'm pretty sure every reader supports equal opportunity, but we need to remember that hierarchy is one of human society's fundamental structures. Even if it disappeared for a moment, we'd find it reappearing very quickly. We can comfort ourselves with the fact that an author's envy breeds wisdom, in that the struggle to the top gives meaning to our lives and drives motivation in humans towards constant improvement. Hierarchic organization in societies is one of the most basic traits among humans. These structures are the unavoidable outcome of non-uniform distributions of skills, IQ, personality traits, primarily those related to conscientiousness, socioeconomic background, the father figure, and fate. Remember the Pareto distribution? No matter how much we try to correct things, in the end, someone will be higher up the ladder at someone else's expense and may even enjoy larger doses of serotonin happily flowing through the bloodstream. Equality of outcome, unlike equal opportunity, is not an ultimate goal that we should be striving for. No one wants their highly talented son to be rejected by the physics department at the top university because the quota for males is already full. And feel free to swap the word males for whites, Asians, or any other group label you wish. The same concept applies. In 2014, a group of American students of Asian origin submitted a case against Harvard University, claiming that the university was employing a diversity target. Simply put, the institution was rejecting candidates of Asian origin because the number of excelling Asians it accepted into studies was not proportionate to their relative numbers within the general population. Actions intended to achieve overwhelming equality of outcome are not only a loss to individuals, but a loss to society, since less talented people will then be accepted into physics, engineering, medical, and other fields of study, and at some point society will need to accept less capable individuals to drive its economy. As the historian Professor Michael Harsegor once noted, the regime preserves the ruler just as vinegar preserves the pickled cucumber. Throughout history, rulers were healthier, enjoyed longer lifespans, produced more offspring, and generally enjoyed life more. History proves that hierarchy is a fact, nor does it care whether the people who managed to climb the hierarchic ladder succeeded due to being good or evil. Mahatma Gandhi, for example, was fairly nice. Hitler, on the other hand, the fact that a historic king is arbitrary and that the strongest people could become terrible leaders might cause us to despair. We've all studied history. We know that some abuse the hierarchic system to wreak suffering and destruction. But to me, that knowledge is pointless if we don't take on board a simple concept. Despite the world being crazy and unpredictable, we should try to overcome our fears and make an effort towards reinforcing the good in ourselves and making the world a better place. This book, for example, is my attempt at doing just that.